Welcome to a new series. In this series, I will be exploring the largest and most influential empires in world history, adding them one by one to this blank map of the world until we have a map of every single empire in world history. In this first episode, we will be discussing the empires of the Ancient Era, starting as early as 3000 BC, covering more than 35 centuries of history. Now, as a quick preface, my definition of an empire is, admittedly, quite arbitrary, as depending on your definition, I could be here all day. My definition will be quite simple. An empire needs to be large and influential in context to the region that they operate in. This means that there isn't a set size that an empire needs to be, as this changes and evolves with the time period and region we're discussing. With that set up, let's dive into the video. We start with the ancient Middle East around 3000 BC. There are no empires yet, but if we look closely, there is the Sumerian culture in a dank river valley in between these two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. But if we go west, we find what I consider the first empire, the Old Egyptian Kingdom, closely following the Nile River. Which makes sense, as leaving the riverline leaves you with nothing but sand. This Old Egyptian Kingdom ruled from the Egyptian Nile Delta all the way to the heart of what is now Sudan. The borders that I've drawn here are just an approximation, however, as you could also decide to extend Egypt's borders outside of the Nile, but it's debatable to what extent this old kingdom could actually exert power here. Around 2200 BC, this old Egyptian kingdom would collapse for several reasons. The king may have lived all the way into his 90s, outliving all of his direct heirs, causing issues with succession, while at the same time the kingdom was increasingly decentralized as the position of governor was hereditary and central authority over outer regions declined. Finally, a simple famine likely rocked the kingdom, weakening the state even more. Whatever the exact reason, collapse the kingdom did. Back in Mesopotamia, we now have our first Mesopotamian empire, the Akkadians. Look at how small and cute it is. Here, it is important to note that these first couple of empires are way smaller to the ones that we'll see later on, as technological and societal difficulties held these empires back. Essentially, these first two empires were still figuring it out, and it's not just size that matters. It's also relevance and reach. This Akkadian empire, despite being small, was the first major empire centralizing most of Mesopotamia. The empire came about thanks to the conquest of Sargon of Akkad, no, not that one, who managed to take control over a single city, expanding this control until reaching its peak. Lasting for about 200 years, the Akkadian Empire would meet its end like most empires of the time. Bad harvests, unrest, and the rise of regionalism dividing the nation, leading to the collapse of the empire in 2154. But over in Egypt, a new period of empire emerged, which would become known as the Middle Kingdom. As you can see, this new kingdom is significantly larger than the old one, as it establishes more definitive control over the coasts, as well as the oases and deserts around Egypt proper. Still though, by far most of the relevant parts of the empire centered around the Nile. The start of this middle period was lauded in by Mentuhotep II, who managed to unite the chaos of small states in the region back into a cohesive whole. This Middle Kingdom would enter decline as a series of weak kings saw a decline in central authority, resulting in an invasion from the Hyksos from the west, who destroyed the Middle Kingdom and set up their own kingdom in the north. In Mesopotamia, meanwhile, a new empire would succeed the Akkadian one, Babylon. Territorially, Babylon was slightly smaller than the previous Akkadian one, but Babylon was arguably even more important. Babylon would shift the center of culture in Mesopotamia to Babylon, and even after the empire had long fallen, other empires that succeeded it would continue to claim their title, and Babylonian culture became extremely influential in the region. The Babylonian time in the sun lasted for about 2 centuries, until they were raided by the Hittites and then conquered by the Kassites. These Kassites would continue to rule over reduced Babylon, but Babylon's time as top empire in the region was over. As we now enter a fascinating period in Middle Eastern history where 4 states, which we can all consider empires to some extent, are going to be fighting a constant diplomatic, economic, and military conflict over hegemony over the region, before most of them would fall as a result of the same event. The first of these, as mentioned before, is the remnants of the Babylonian Empire under Kassite rulership. The second is the Hittite Empire, which at its greatest extent ruled over much of Anatolia while pushing deep into the Middle East as well. At their peak, they had destroyed the power of the Babylonians in a massive raid, but even after that peak, the Hittites remained an influential force in the balance of power. Next up, we have another Egyptian kingdom, creatively named the New Egyptian Kingdom, the final Egyptian empire ruled by Egyptians. This would also be the absolute peak of Egyptian power, being bigger than both predecessors, spreading Egyptian rule from Sudan in the south to the Levant in the north. Of the four big Middle Eastern powers, Egypt was arguably the strongest, as should be clear from this map. This new kingdom is also where most of our knowledge of Egypt comes from, as we have a lot more sources for the new kingdom than for the middle and the old ones before it. This would be the Egypt of well-known pharaohs like Ramesses II, Tutankhamun and Akhenaten. Back to the map, the final empire is the Middle Assyrian Empire. Located in the north of Mesopotamia, the Middle Assyrian Empire was a major power, but by no means was this the peak of their power. Because, starting somewhere around 1200 BC, the Bronze Age collapse would take place. What exactly happened is hotly debated amongst historians, and it's likely a mix of events, with changes to the climate and a stream of raiders known as the Sea Peoples from the West shaking up the world. Who these Sea Peoples were is to this very day unknown, but they raided and caused devastation wherever they went. Within a century, the Hittite Empire and the New Kingdom of Egypt would have completely collapsed, leaving only Babylon and the Middle Assyrian Empire. This would mark a peak for the Middle Assyrian Empire, as they made use of the power vacuum to temporarily take charge of most of Mesopotamia before declining significantly again. But the Assyrian Empire had not yet had its last laugh. Upon the ascendancy of Adad-nirari II, the Assyrians form a new empire, often referred to as the Neo-Assyrian Empire. This would see Assyria rise to such an immense and powerful position that they were the undisputed hegemons of the known world of the Middle East for almost 2 centuries. Their main asset was their terrifying army, which they used to impose their will upon their subjects and the surrounding states. After their long reign of terror, the Assyrian Empire would meet its demise thanks to a coalition of states working to bring them down, both from the inside and outside. This would mark a revival of what would become known as the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which managed to shortly after become the dominant power of the Middle East. These Babylonians are most well known for their capture of Judea, where they moved the Jewish people to Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar II, which would be a massively transformative phase for the religious experience of the Jewish people. But this Babylonian time in the spotlight was not to last, as the era of puny Middle Eastern empires is about to decisively end, thanks to this man, Cyrus the Great. Cyrus would take control over this already very large Median Empire, founding the Medo-Persian or Achaemenid Empire. Cyrus would take this empire to extreme heights, creating an empire that stretches from the Indus River to the east to Greece and Egypt in the west, quite literally encapsulating all of the other empires discussed so far and then some, which is just incredibly impressive. But before we discuss the fall of this empire, let's take a detour to the rest of the world. The Americas, sadly, don't have any big empires that I can report on. Or, perhaps more truthfully, they don't have any empires that we have definitive proof of existence of. For example, in the Andes Mountains there was the Nordic civilization, but to what extent they were empire builders is unclear, and we do not know of any concrete empires during this era. A similar story exists for the cultures like the Maya, who we know existed in a large area, but we don't know whether and how they formed empires. Judging by the other cradles of civilization, it makes sense to presume that some form of empire was formed here as well, but we simply don't know. Moving over to Africa, we have a couple of empires to discuss. The first, and perhaps the most prominent, is the Kingdom of Axum. At its peak, Axum controlled areas of East Africa, as well as crossing over to Yemen across the Red Sea. And it's regarded as the start of the Ethiopian Empire, which more or less managed to have a continuous existence streak from 50 BC until 1976, when the empire was abolished. Axum is also important because of their adoption of Christianity in 330, being one of the first states in the world to do so. Around 940 AD, the Axumite Empire would finally fall, thereby being by far the longest lasting empire I'm going to cover today, lasting a whopping 910 years. Centered around Sudan, there is another empire known as the Kushite Empire. These Kushites are often sidelined by Egypt, but Sudan itself was a cradle of civilization much like Egypt itself was. The Kushite peak in power would come about in the 8th century BC, when the Kushite managed to peacefully gain Upper Egypt, continuing to conquer the Egyptian Delta as well, uniting Sudan and Egypt under Kushite leadership. Kushite rule over Egypt would last until the Assyrians invaded the region, reducing the Kushites back to Sudan, where it would continue for about 1,000 more years, finally fully collapsing in 550 AD. Moving all the way over to the east, there is one region that has a constant roller coaster of empires, much like the Middle East: China. Along the Yellow River, the first Chinese empire is the Xia. The Xia are a very interesting entity, as their very existence is clouded in mystery. There are few contemporary sources, we don't know which lands they controlled, though what I've displayed here is what I see most often claimed. Despite their disputed existence, they are often placed as the first dynasty in the Grand Tale of China, and as such, I think it's important to mention them here. The Xia supposedly fell around 1600 as their final king Jie, supposedly an immoral and tyrannical ruler, was overthrown by Tang. Tang would then immediately after found the next Chinese dynasty, the Shang. These Shang are supported by extensive archaeological evidence, and their existence is not in doubt. The Shang already built an absolutely massive empire, unifying much of the Yellow River basin under their control. After about 600 years of being the top dog in China, the Shang would collapse as a result of an invasion from the Zhao. The Zhao would justify their invasion by claiming that the Shang had lost the approval of the heavens, which would be a theme repeated many times across China's dynastic history. And as we should expect, these Zhao immediately took up the mantle as the next Chinese dynasty, being massively influential in the development of China as we know it, expanding its boundaries even further and introducing three major concepts in Chinese philosophy: Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism. Very oversimplified, these concepts would dominate the way of life, governance, and religion in China for the next 2 millennia. The Zhao would last for a whopping 789 years, becoming the longest lasting dynasty in all of Chinese history. The reign of the Zhao, however, was split into two periods. The first period is known as the Western Zhao, where they would be a strong state. But, over time, their decentralized system would lead to its decline. Officially, the Zhao Emperor would still rule over the entire empire, but actual Zhao control became restricted to a very small area. This would become known as the Spring and Autumn period. Things got even worse during the Warring States period, where the Zhao still officially ruled as emperors, but their actual control was now near zero. China found itself in a constant period of shifting states fighting for dominance. The end of this Warring States period would come when the Qin, from their western holdings, managed to unify China again, starting the extremely long and epic reign of the Qin dynasty, lasting an incredible 15 years before collapsing again. As after the death of the founder of the empire, infighting between two advisors attempting to control the next puppet emperor would result in the death of all three and the collapse of the empire. But despite Qin reign being short, they were instrumental in the story of China. Their founder literally invented the title Huangdi, the Chinese version of emperor. Before the Qin, there was no real Chinese emperor, just a very dominant Chinese king. The Qin also created the idea that Chinese unity was the natural state of the region, not just something that happened when a king got too powerful. The Qin were also the first dynasty to add parts of southern China to their domain. Finally, the name Qin made its way through Persia to Rome, where the Romans mispronounced it as China, making the Qin the origin for our Western term, China. And upon the collapse of the Qin, there would be another short period of division in China, becoming divided into 18 new kingdoms, the most important of which were the Chu in the east and the Han in the west. After 4 years of war, the Han would manage to reunify most of China, after which they would crush the previous record of largest Chinese state. These Han are fundamental to the Chinese identity, as Chinese language, writing, and people are all known as Han. At their peak, the Han had reached further north, south, and west than any dynasty before them, taking great care to integrate conquered people into the new empire. The impact of the Han on China is often compared to the impact of Rome on Europe. The difference? Where Rome failed to create a permanently unified entity, the framework left by the Han would leave the blueprint for China for the next 2000 years in terms of culture, ethnicity, and borders. The Han would rule, with a small interruption, from 202 BC up until 220 AD, and with their fall, we enter the period of the Three Kingdoms, which, as the name suggests, sees three main empires battle for supremacy over China. I do not have the time to go into too much detail on this period, especially since it has been expertly covered plenty of times before, but all we need to know is that 3 Chinese empires are fighting for control. In the north we have the Wei, in the southeast we have the Wu, and in the southwest we have the Shu Han. After decades of conflict, the Shu would be the first to fall thanks to an invasion from the Wei. The Wei themselves, however, would not last much longer, as 3 years later infighting would lead to the Wei falling to the new Jin dynasty. These Jin would manage to conquer the Wu, once again reunifying China under a new dynasty, following roughly the same borders as the Han before them. Soon after, though, the Jin would lose control over much of northern China due to civil wars, raids from the steppes and rebellions. The Jin would last for roughly 2 centuries, until in 420 they decisively collapsed as they were usurped by the Liu Song dynasty. The Liu Song would mark the official start of the period of the northern and southern dynasties, where power in China would be split between north and south. This situation would persist over the next 2 centuries. While we were following the Jin in the south, in the north there was a period of division known as the Era of the 16 Kingdoms, until the former Xin managed to reunify North China under their rule. Soon though, they would lose an engagement against the Jin, shattering their power. After another period of division, the northern Wei would eventually manage to reunify northern China under their rule. At its peak, they looked like this, controlling northern China for nearly 2 centuries. These northern Wei significantly expanded the control that the emperors had over the population, which would be adopted by future Chinese dynasties as well. Eventually though, internal division would cause its division between the eastern and the western Wei. This would be the start of a split in northern China, which would last for about 50 years. The western Wei would be usurped by the northern Zhao, who would manage to massively expand their control. Meanwhile, the eastern Wei were usurped by the northern Xi, who did very little until they were conquered by the northern Zhao as well. This northern Zhao domination over northern China lasted for a whopping 4 years, until they too were overthrown by the Sui dynasty. Meanwhile, the south had a similar tale of division. We start with Liu Song, who were primarily known for their incompetent emperors, with especially Emperor Ming being well known for murdering many of his male relatives to secure his throne. The Liu Song, as a result of their lacking emperors, would eventually be overthrown by the southern Xi, and they would be known for little apart from being an extremely unstable period in southern Chinese history. The southern Xi, amazingly, had their own Emperor Ming, who also executed many of his potential rivals. These cruel rulers would ignite rebellions, resulting in an ambitious general managing to take charge, founding the Liang dynasty. Ruling southern China for 50 years, the Liang would oversee the decline of southern Chinese power, eventually being usurped by the Chen dynasty. Here, we need to once again pay attention to all of China combined, as the Sui would strike down from the north, finally ending the over 200 years of separation between northern and southern China. Moving up from China, we have the steppe lands of Mongolia. Now, it's incredibly difficult to recognize what constitutes an empire in regards to the steppes. For example, this is how the Scythians are often shown on the map. A quite large entity, but we shouldn't forget that most of this land is empty grazeland, which the Horde sometimes passes through, but doesn't have permanent control over. For this reason, I will not be including many steppe empires, apart from a couple really unignorable ones. One of these is the Xiongnu Confederacy, which is so large that it's the only empire in this entire video which clocks in on the top 10 largest empires in history list, beating out such pathetic empires as Rome, Persia and the Ottomans. Good job, Xiongnu. The Xiongnu would eventually be destroyed in conflicts with the Han dynasty, ending the 10th largest empire in history. Moving down to the Indian subcontinent, I had a lot of trouble with deciding what was and wasn't an empire here. We've talked about 20 Chinese entities, which I all considered some form of empire, which I think is justified given the size, wealth, population and importance of China. But China had the advantage of being relatively unified, with periods of division being the exception, not the rule. Which usually means that even when divided, there are a couple of powerful nations fighting each other, making it relatively easy to say that at least the largest of these are in fact candidates for emperorship. Meanwhile, this is an average map of India. Can you spot the empire? Is this an empire? Is this an empire? Is this an empire? I don't know. For me, the main criteria for being an empire is being dominant within your region. So, I will only count something as an Indian empire if they are significantly more powerful than the other states on the subcontinent. India's start to proven empires is relatively late. They may have had empires as early as the Indus River Valley civilization, but like the Nordichico and the Mayans, it's unclear if they actually built empires. Later periods had many Indian states, but none of these stood above the rest to such an extent that I would call them an empire. This would change when this kingdom, the Kingdom of Magadha, would start a road towards building a bunch of Indian empires. The first is the Shishonga Empire, which at its peak would establish itself as the largest Indian state, consolidating much of the east coast. Here, it's important to note that there is a lot of debate about ancient India and its borders due to a lack of sources. I base my empires and their borders mainly on the video The History of India Every Year by Ollie Bai. So if you see a map somewhere that shows different borders, this is why. This Shishunga Empire would end when the Nanda dynasty would overthrow them, starting the Nanda Empire. This Nanda Empire would manage to unify all of northern India. But they were extremely unpopular due to high taxes and the low status of their emperors and just general abuse of powers from the monarchs. An interesting tidbit is that this Nanda Empire is the one that Alexander the Great had hoped to invade after conquering Persia, but more on him later. Because right now, in the north of India, this man, Chandragupta Maurya, has raised an army in rebellion against the Nanda, soon overthrowing them and founding the Maurya Empire. But they weren't done. Oh no. Because the Maurya Empire would expand all the way from Afghanistan to Myanmar, creating an absolutely enormous empire. During their reign, they would spread Buddhism across the Indian subcontinent and beyond. Then, the Maurya would enter a slow decline before their final empire was assassinated, resulting in a new Shanga Empire, as Pushyamitra Shanga usurped the throne. These Shanga would be around for about a century, but they were no longer alone as the sole Indian empire. Because in the south, starting as a Maurya vassal, was the Satavahana Empire. The Satavahana would seize much of central India as a result of the decline of the Maurya, and at its peak they would control much of India, extending all the way to Bengal. This Satavahana dynasty would last for 5 centuries, surviving many ups and downs before finally falling after central authority declined. Meanwhile, there was a third empire next to the Shanga and the Satavahana, the Mahameghavahana Empire. For about 150 years, the Mahameghavahana dominated the eastern Indian coast, before falling as a result of Satavahana invasion. In the west, we have the Indo-Scythian kingdom, also known as the Western Satraps, who at their peak managed to dominate west and central India for a little while. But their time in the sun wouldn't last long, as from the north, a new empire is taking shape, the Kushan Empire. A nomadic confederation, the Kushans would create an absolutely massive empire spreading from Central Asia all the way down to India, although slowly declining in power afterwards thanks to their decentralized nation. From here, we have a temporary period where we don't have any Indian empires for about 200 years. But watch, this small state is about to do something amazing. Over the next 70 years, the Guptan Empire would manage to unify most of India for about 200 years. This era of Gupta rule was considered one of India's golden ages, though it eventually entered decline thanks to weakening centralization, rebellions, and devastating invasions from Afghanistan, which would lead to the collapse of this Gupta Empire. With that, we have now covered all of the empire in ancient Asian history, and it's time to return to the Mediterranean, where we can discuss the fall of the Persian Empire. Because in Greece, some kid wanted to prove that he's literally the best person that has ever lived, ever, and so he decided to cross the Bosphorus to conquer the Persian Empire. Judging by the size of these two nations, you'd expect the Persians to crush this kid, but no. Alexander the Great blasted through the Persian Empire, collapsing it and allowing him to replace it with his own Macedonian Empire. An epic empire, a large empire, an empire that is surely meant to last for it has already collapsed. Alexander the Great had died, likely from disease or alcohol poisoning, and with a lack of a suitable heir, his generals divided his empires between themselves. 2 of these successor kingdoms I will consider empires. In Egypt, we have Ptolemaic Egypt. This is the Egypt that interacted with the Romans and had figures like Cleopatra in charge. Both of these kingdoms were Greek, at least their monarchs and their upper classes were, but we will discuss Egypt later in relation to the Roman Empire. The other empire is the Seleucid Empire, an absolutely massive empire practically taking the place of the old Persian Empire. The Seleucid Empire practically started at their peak, slowly declining in power over the next couple of centuries. A major cause of their decline was an attempted invasion of Greece proper, which failed as a result of Roman intervention, resulting in massive war reparations and a reduction in Seleucid power and prestige. The true Seleucid downfall would come at the hands of the Parthians, who had seized Persia. The Seleucid continued for a while in the Middle East, until even their remnants were picked off by the Romans and the Parthians. We will get back to the Parthians in a little bit, but let's move to the Western Mediterranean first, where we have the Carthaginian empires. Traders at heart, through their strong navy, they dominated the seas and became extremely rich. As practically the only strong power in the Western Mediterranean, surely nothing could stop this empire. Wait, what's that? Oh no, look like some angry Latin boys are fighting the Carthaginians, destroying their empire while starting to build their own Mediterranean-spanning empire. For now, it's a republic, but this man, Julius Caesar, is attempting to end that republic, leading to Republican defenders ending him instead. The subsequent Roman Civil War would see Caesar's nephew become the first Roman emperor, starting the Roman Empire. The Roman Civil War had seen Cleopatra's Egypt side with Mark Antony in the hope of taking over the Roman Empire, resulting in the destruction of Ptolemaic Egypt. Rome would soon see its absolute peak in size, stretching from England to the Persian Gulf. During this entire period, it would be in competition with empires in Iran, even after the Roman Empire had split in two and the western portion of the empire had fallen to Germanic invasion. This Germanic invasion had been driven by another empire, the Hunnic Empire. The borders of this empire are disputed, as this is another nomadic empire, sometimes shown as large as this. What is certain, however, is that the Huns were very large and influential, driving Germanic migrations into Rome, massively contributing to its downfall. But, as a nomadic empire, they collapsed as fast as they emerged. But Rome is not fully done. Eastern Rome, often called Byzantium for convenience, would last for a whopping 1000 more years after collapsing. This story, however, will be left for the next video in this series, where we explore medieval empires. But let's take a final look at the Parthians, who are currently just vibing, fighting with the Romans constantly, which managed to weaken their power, leading to the Sasanians overtaking the Parthians in Iran. At their peak, during a war against the Byzantines, the Sasanians would manage to create an amazingly large empire, reminiscent of the Achaemenid Empire of old. But this Sasanian-Byzantine war would be their final hurrah, because in Arabia, a new empire is growing, based around their new religion, Islam. Their full story will be left for the next video, but spoiler alert, within a short 30 years, they would strike from Arabia and destroy the Sassanid Empire, making the Sassanids the final pagan Iranian empire. And this gives us our final map at the end of this video. This map shows every piece of land on Earth which, in my opinion, has been held by an empire during the ancient era. More interestingly though, here is a map of every single empire overlaid. It's a complete mess, but you can still see some interesting things, like Persia, China, and the Middle East being clearly way more populated by empires than other regions. Here is the same map, but as a heat map of empires. This makes it even more clear that most of the ancient empires are indeed concentrated on the Middle East, Persia, and China. This also makes an empire like Rome even more unique, as most of Rome's territory, especially at the start, hadn't been a part of a previous empire. So, as it stands at the end of this video, only about 20% of the world has been a part of an empire. In the next video in this series, we will be diving into medieval empires and fill this map up some more. But that's it for this video. Thank you all for watching, consider leaving a like and a comment to support the content. Subscribe for 2 more videos every single week. To continue watching, click on one of the 2 videos on screen, I'm sure they're going to be a perfect fit for you. Again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.